Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling the fascinating and pretty foundational story of Arab nationalism.
Yes.
You shared some really rich material with us, excerpts from The Origins of Arab Nationalism, a collection edited by Rashid Khalidi and others, published back in 1991.
That's right.
Our goal today is to really, get under the skin of this topic and understand the core drivers and maybe some of the ongoing debates about how this powerful force in history actually came to be.
Exactly. And what's so valuable about these excerpts, I think, is that they give us multiple angles. We're looking at, well, the impact of the West, the inner workings of the Ottoman Empire, the ripple effects of the Young Turks movement,
Right.
and also that vibrant intellectual life happening in the Arab provinces, late 19th, early 20th centuries. It's definitely not a simple story with one clear starting point, more like a convergence.
It rarely is it? And for you, our listener, someone who's keen to build a solid understanding quickly without getting bogged down in perhaps excessive detail, this is really designed to give you a clear pathway through what can be a complex history.
Yeah.
We're aiming for those moments where things kind of click into place, and you see the bigger picture. Okay, so let's start unpacking. One of the initial ideas about where Arab nationalism came from, this connection to the West, what did the excerpts say about that?
Well, the book points out that a common early explanation was that Arab nationalism basically arose from contact with the West.
Okay.
And this idea often focused on Christian Arabs. The argument went that they were influenced by, Western science, secular thought, maybe missionary activity.
Missionaries.
Yeah, the thinking was, feeling maybe a bit separate under Ottoman rule, they looked towards Europe and adopted these nationalist ideas.
That sounds, well, it sounds almost too neat, doesn't it? But the book complicates that picture. Yeah.
It certainly does. The authors argue that when you really dig into the historical record, it's actually quite difficult to find strong, persuasive evidence of widespread sympathy for Arab nationalism among, say, European Christians or even the Arab bourgeoisie, the merchant class, at that specific time.
Hmm.
It wasn't necessarily a direct import of some fully formed ideology, and that's a really crucial point, I think.
Why crucial?
Because it shifts the focus. Instead of seeing it as purely reactive, like just responding to the West, it suggests a more internally driven evolution, something rooted in Arab intellectual and social dynamics.
Yeah.
It suggests agency, rather than just imitation.
Okay, so not just adopting a Western blueprint. What about the influence of those Western missionary schools specifically? That was another factor often cited, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The role of missionary schools is another piece of this puzzle, and they undoubtedly introduced Western concepts, maybe helped increase the importance of the Arabic language in education in some ways.
Bit of butt coming, I feel.
There is. The book offers a more nuanced perspective. It acknowledges their influence, sure, but it stresses that these schools primarily had their own religious and educational goals.
Right. So fostering Arab nationalism wasn't exactly top of their list.
Precisely. And maybe even more importantly, the book highlights that a really significant portion of the educational and intellectual elite in the Arab provinces back then, and this includes many early proponents of Arab nationalism, were actually graduates of Ottoman educational institutions.
Ah, okay. Not just the missionary schools.
Exactly, which suggests that the intellectual ferment, the ideas leading towards Arab nationalism, were also very much happening within the existing Ottoman structures, not just outside them.
Okay, interesting. So Western influence, maybe more indirect, part of a much bigger, more complex picture. Let's pivot then to the Ottoman Empire itself. How did its own policies, maybe the state of the empire, contribute to the growth of this Arab nationalist sentiment?
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. The perceived weakening of the Ottoman Empire, late 19th, early 20th centuries, that created a palpable sense of anxiety among Arab intellectuals.
Anxiety, like
And
uncertainty.
Uncertainty, yeah. They saw the empire struggling, not maintaining its former strength and stability.
Yeah.
And this definitely led to a growing unease.
Okay.
And then, on top of that, you had the Ottoman government's efforts to centralize power and the increasing dominance of Turkish influence within the empire. Well, that generated considerable resentment in the Arab provinces.
Oh, so
Arabs increasingly felt like they were being treated as, well, second-class citizens.
So it wasn't just about external ideas coming from the West, but significant internal dynamics within the Ottoman Empire were creating pressure.
Absolutely. The Ottoman emphasis on Turkish patriotism as the sort of central unifying force, often at the expense of recognizing, let alone valuing, other ethnic identities within the empire, that led many Arabs to feel marginalized, like Lebanon. And this naturally fostered a desire for, greater Arab autonomy, a more meaningful role within the empire.
But initially, the aim wasn't necessarily to completely break away, right? Not independence straight off the bat.
That's a critical point. You're right. For many early Arab intellectuals and reformers, the initial goal was not outright independence.
Okay.
Instead, they largely sought reforms within the Ottoman system. They were advocating for things like greater Arab representation in government, in the administration, a more equitable distribution of resources and power.
So looking for a better deal within the existing framework, basically.
Exactly.
Now, then the Young Turks emerged, promising reform, a new era. How did their actions ultimately impact this rise of Arab nationalism?
Right, the Young Turks.
Hmm.
Their rise and those initial promises, modernization, constitutionalism, greater inclusivity, around 1908, they were met with considerable optimism by some Arab intellectuals and political figures.
Understandably.
Yeah, they saw an opportunity. Maybe Arabs could finally gain a more equitable footing within a reformed empire.
So a moment of real hope there.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
But that hope was ultimately pretty short-lived. Despite their initial reformist energy, the Young Turks increasingly adopted policies of, Turkification.
Turkification. What exactly does that mean in this context?
It means policies that really emphasize Turkish language, Turkish culture, Turkish identity as the sole unifying force within the empire, and often actively suppressing other ethnic expressions, including Arab culture and language.
Wow, that must have been a profound disappointment, a turning point even.
It really was, and the book highlights the significant irony. The Young Turk Revolution, which was intended to modernize and strengthen the empire, inadvertently became a major catalyst for the growth of Arab nationalism.
How so?
Well, their centralizing and exclusionary policies essentially pushed Arabs who had initially just sought integration, pushed them towards demanding greater autonomy, and eventually, independence. It became a reaction against this enforced Turkish identity.
So the very movement that promised reform ended up fueling the desire for separation. Fascinating. Now, alongside these political shifts, there was also this vital intellectual and cultural awakening happening, the Nada. How did that contribute?
The Nada, the Arab Renaissance. Yes, late 19th, early 20th century is absolutely crucial. It was this period of renewed interest, a real flourishing of Arabic language, literature, history, culture.
Okay.
And this cultural revival provided the sort of essential foundation for a shared sense of Arab identity. You saw a resurgence in classical Arabic literature, but also a new wave of writing exploring themes of Arab identity, calling for social and political reform.
Like a rediscovery and celebration of a common cultural inheritance.
Precisely. Arab intellectuals, writers, they began to articulate a distinct Arab consciousness. They were delving into their rich history, their literary traditions. And this intellectual ferment naturally led to critiques of Ottoman rule.
Makes sense.
And the articulation of ideas about Arab distinctiveness, Arab aspirations, they were essentially building the ideological framework, bit by bit, for Arab nationalism.
And these ideas weren't just confined to a small circle, were they? I imagine the development of an Arab press must have been pretty instrumental in spreading these things more broadly.
Oh, absolutely. The growth of an Arab press, newspapers, journals circulating throughout the Arab provinces played a vital role. It disseminated these emerging nationalist ideas among the educated elite, yes, but it also created a kind of public sphere.
A space for discussion.
Exactly. A space for dialogue, debate, and the development of a shared Arab narrative, a sense of collective identity that could, transcend purely local loyalties.
So you've got these political disappointments with the Ottomans, then the Young Turks happening alongside this powerful cultural and intellectual reawakening. It really does sound like the perfect conditions, almost, for nationalist sentiment to take hold.
It was a potent mix.
Now, the book also delves into the diverse motivations of those who embraced early Arabism. It wasn't a unified movement with one single aim, was it?
No, definitely not. Early Arabism was far from being a single unified entity. The motivations, the objectives of its early proponents were actually quite varied.
How so?
Well, some were primarily focused on achieving administrative reforms within the Ottoman Empire, seeking greater Arab representation in government, a fairer share of resources. For these people, the initial aim wasn't necessarily creating independent Arab states.
Right, more about seeking internal change than outright separation. For some, at least.
Exactly. Then you had others who placed a greater emphasis on cultural autonomy. Their main goal was the recognition and promotion of Arab language, culture, heritage, pushing back against those Turkification policies we mentioned.
Okay.
And then, of course, as the political landscape kept shifting, and especially after the disillusionment with the Young Turks, you saw a growing number who did begin to advocate for full political independence.
Right. And how did religious identity, specifically Islam, intersect with all this, with this evolving Arab identity and the rise of nationalism?
Well, Islam played a complex role, a multifaceted role, really. For some, Arabism was seen as a way to revitalize the historical glory of Islamic civilization, with Arabs holding this central, honored place within that history.
Okay.
In that view, Arab identity and Islamic identity were very closely intertwined, mutually reinforcing. A shared Islamic heritage was seen as a key component of Arab identity.
A sense of shared history rooted in both Arab culture and Islamic faith.
Yes, but for others, the emphasis was more on a shared Arab cultural and linguistic heritage, one that transcended religious boundaries.
Ah, interesting.
This perspective sought to unite all Arabic-speaking peoples, regardless of their specific religious affiliations, Muslim, Christian, etc., emphasizing a common Arab identity as the primary unifying factor. So you had both overlapping and sometimes distinct understandings of what it meant to be Arab and how Islam fit into that picture.
Very complex. And geographically, where were the early hubs of this activity? Was it spread evenly across all the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire?
No, not really evenly spread. The intensity and focus of early Arabism definitely varied. Regions like, say, Syria and Lebanon, which had a more developed intellectual infrastructure, more active press, perhaps greater exposure to Western ideas, though, as we discussed, not necessarily simple adoption.
Right.
Those areas emerged as early centers of nationalist thought and activity.
So, a concentration of these emerging ideas in specific areas. Now, the book also points out that it's quite difficult to pinpoint a precise birth date or a single coherent ideology for early Arab nationalism. Why is it so challenging to define it neatly?
Well, the authors really emphasized that early Arab nationalism wasn't some creation. It was a gradual, evolving phenomenon. It didn't have a singular founding moment or a fully formed ideology that everyone just immediately signed up to. It was characterized by a real variety of expressions, shifting priorities, as historical circumstances change. It was very much a movement, or perhaps movements, in formation.
More of a slow evolution than a sudden revolution in thought, maybe.
Precisely. And furthermore, many of the early proponents, the people pushing these ideas, were often part of relatively small groups, sometimes secret or semi-secret societies.
Right.
And that makes it difficult for historians today to accurately gauge their true level of influence, their popular support at the time, simply because the historical record from those very early stages can be fragmented, incomplete.
So reconstructing this early history is a bit like piecing together a puzzle with quite a few pieces missing.
Absolutely. It requires really careful analysis of the evidence we do have and an understanding that these early nationalist sentiments were fluid. They were still very much in the process of taking shape.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the origins of Arab nationalism, it's crystal clear it wasn't the product of just one single cause.
No.
It was really the result of a complex interplay of factors. You had the declining Ottoman Empire, the dashed hopes raised by the Young Turks, this vibrant Arab intellectual and cultural revival, the Nahda, and these evolving understandings of Arab identity, which both drew upon and sometimes transcended religious affiliations.
Yeah.
And while Western influence definitely played a role, it wasn't that simple story of just adopting Western ideas that was maybe once assumed.
That's a really insightful way to summarize it.
Yeah.
What's so compelling, I think, is seeing how these internal pressures, these intellectual shifts within the Arab world itself were so fundamental in shaping this really powerful historical force.
It really underscores how historical movements often arise from a convergence, doesn't it? Different streams coming together, not simply being imposed from the outside.
Exactly.
And considering the diverse, evolving nature of early Arab nationalism, how it was shaped by internal Ottoman dynamics, just as much as external influences, it really makes you think. How do these complex, sometimes even contradictory origins continue to shape the diverse political landscapes and national identities across the Arab world today?
That's a profound question.
Perhaps that's a crucial question to keep in mind as we observe the region's ongoing transformations. Thank you for joining me on this really fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. It was great discussing it.